Okay, so let's return to this discussion of the legal process involved in the formation of racialized slavery in Virginia. Again, this is the transition towards it being a slave society. And we were talking about in the previous video this movement from individual cases of litigation towards that of statutes, whereby precedents would be set to serve as future examples um, of similar circumstances, right? Because again, there was no clear legal articulation of slaves and their status. Um, Another way to see this is that the line between slavery and freedom was actually quite porous, okay, because of that lack of clear definitions, right? One could not assume that a person of African descent who arrived as a slave was going to be a slave for life. And again, similar treatment was um, applied to them as was towards servants. Now, one of the most important statutes that passes in the Virginia colony provided for persons of African descent to be perpetual slaves. Okay, and again, let me remind you, all these laws, these statutes apply solely to persons with black skin. So, as the name suggests, perpetual slavery entails lifelong slavery. You can imagine the scenario in Virginia when you see some Africans being born in the New World, and the status arises. Well, are they slaves too, right? Well, um, perpetual slavery as a law will make that actually a reality for persons of African descent. That is to say, they're lifelong slaves. They will be slaves from birth to death, right? From womb to tomb, so to say, right? So, of course, the advantages, economically speaking, to slave owners are apparent. What they have here are the children of the original slaves, you know, um, they're basically replenishing their supply, right? Because the children serve as this replenishment. Okay, so you can imagine that slave owners would encourage their slaves to have as many kids as possible, right? Um, so that important law, perpetual slavery, is important to note, right? Now, again, you are a slave from cradle to grave, so to say, right? Now, let's recall again in our comparison with past slave societies in world history, it was not necessarily the case that slaves were perpetual slaves. So, this is what makes New World slavery in the English colonies particularly unique, and you could argue particularly egregious. And that is to say, once it becomes attached to a certain race, right, or skin color, stated otherwise, and once you make for the provision that they are perpetually slaves, well, that means it lasts forever, right? And it becomes attached. You can see how it becomes connected or attached to that idea of racialized slavery, whereby, every person's you see with dark skin are also slaves, right? Okay, so perpetual slavery is crucial in the formation of racialized slavery. Another one would be to make slavery hereditary, all right? And that's, of course, called hereditary slavery. Now, this deserves interesting discussion here because it's what the Virginia jurists do to provide for this, okay, which kind of arouses our curiosity. Now, actually requires a little bit of explanation here. In terms of inheriting social status in the 1600s, especially in Europe, as you can imagine, one's social status was inherited by your father. And that's because, of course, a patriarchal society where the men are basically, identifying the family through the male and his family. So that means even social status occurs. Social status is passed along to his children. All right. It doesn't surprise us, however, that this happens because think about the feudal social system, whereby, again, if you're from the noble class, you can be assured that the children of the noble class are also going to inherit nobility. Or on the opposite end, peasants will inherit their status as peasants from their father. Okay, so that's what's happening originally with Virginia, and that's what's happening with English persons. Now it's kind of changing though, because I mentioned this in England. You're going to have this tradition of freedom, beginning to ferment among, especially English political thinkers. They're going to assert that persons who are English are born with certain rights, so that flies in the face of inheriting one's social status, right? And even when you think about the universal rights of Englishmen that we discussed earlier, right? That definitely is something that destabilizes, if you will, dislodges the idea that social status should be inherited. Rather, it says that you're born with certain rights, and an economic sense in the capitalist system, you can see how this is going to encourage notions of like hard work leading to upward mobility. Okay, so again, in the English colony of Virginia before Bacon's Rebellion, certainly you had the case where the English persons there were indeed inheriting their social status from their father, even though, like I said, things were becoming more fluid. Excuse me. Okay, but here's what they do in Virginia. What they did is provide that all children born between couples of African descent will inherit their social status not from their father, but from the mother. And moreover, they'll say in a case of a child born of a white master and the African slave woman, the same thing applies. Okay, social status for all persons of African descent that are born in the New World, according to Virginia statute, they will inherit their social status not from their father, but rather from their mother. And you see this term here in parentheses, partus sequitur ventrum. Okay, and basically this is the Latin expression of that in the law, where your status follows, ventrum is womb, so it follows from the womb, meaning the mother, right? So you can imagine how useful this is for the Virginia plantation owners, right? The planter class. This provides or entails that all persons born will inherit the social status of their mom. All children born from the mother's womb, automatically is a slave, right? Excuse me. Even in the union of a white master and the slave woman, no longer is this a case that's, sort of improvised upon by the jury, the jurist, that is. No, it's now setting the precedent that they are indeed slaves, no matter what. So hopefully you can see how both perpetual slavery, which again makes slavery it's lifelong slavery, and hereditary slavery, which makes slavery inherited for all the children of future generations, is going to work towards this idea of racialized slavery. That is to say, every person of black skin will be a lifelong slave, and it will be automatically inherited upon birth for all persons. Okay, so that's how race gets connected to slavery in Virginia. In particular, these two statutes work effectively. Now, another sort of circumstance arose that sort of questioned whether or not African slaves should be enslaved, right? And this was a sort of Christian practice, of course, found in Europe, but of course it was transmitted to Virginia, and it was this idea that Christians cannot enslave other Christians. It was sort of a understood or tacit understanding among Christians. You can't enslave a fellow Christian. But of course, what's happening in Virginia is eventually the conversion of Africans, and and by the way, as I mentioned here, we have the creation of African Americans because they're born in the New World, right? So you can start using the term African American for the offspring after the first generations, right? But in any case, you see cases whereby the generations after generations of African Americans born in the New World will be converted to Christianity. So, how do you reconcile that contradiction, especially for those who really believe in this? Well, Virginia found a way to bypass this loophole, okay? And to be precise, by 1667, you see the passing of laws that provided for slaves of African descent. Even if they're converted to Christianity, they could still be enslaved. Okay, so even though you're a Christian, it no longer mattered, right? So here's the law again, lending itself towards this formation of racialized slavery in Virginia. All right. Now, eventually, especially after Bacon's Rebellion, so that's again the political dimension. You have economics and political aspects. You also have cultural ones playing in here, like Christianity. Well, the cumulative effect here, the cumulative result is racialized slavery. And of course, that's basically means the outcome in Virginia is that you are now a slave society. And again, slaves will become the primary labor force, not English servants. Okay, so again, this is what makes slavery unique in the New World and even in America, right? Things like perpetual slavery and hereditary slavery contributing towards racialized slavery. And, in the history of slavery that, again, has been around since the beginning of humankind, it makes it quite unique, right? That a whole race will become branded with the social status of slave for centuries, right? Until, in our country, 1865, the end of the Civil War, and the passage of the 13th Amendment, formally abolishing slavery. Now, what's going to happen is, of course, you see other colonies being formed, after the Virginia colony. In the southern regions, what we call today the South, we're going to see the establishment of the Carolinas, and then that'll become, of course, North and South Carolina. Georgia by the early 1700s. And, these areas were originally conceived as a buffer against Spanish presence below the English settlements, right? But, as you can imagine, they're also thinking commercially. So in the Carolinas, it's interesting because they discovered that tobacco was not the most practical, if you will, crop to grow there given the conditions. If you know anything about Carolina, it's more swampy, right? A lot of mosquitoes. Different terrain, different climate altogether. So they did discover, however, that rice was going to be the monocrop there, the cash crop. The only problem is the English really didn't know how to grow rice. And you probably know why, because you can't grow rice in England. So what happened was very interesting. They started to seek knowledge from the slaves themselves from Africa on how to cultivate rice. So what the African slaves did is provide the English planters with the knowledge of how to grow rice, and the systems involved, like draining swamps and the cultivation needs, right? Irrigation and so on and so forth. So it's ironic that the African slaves are providing not only the intensive labor behind the production of their profit, but also the knowledge itself, right? And really, all the North Carolina slavers had to do was make sure their slaves worked, right? And incidentally, the Carolina planters growing rice and other things like indigo, used to make dye and other crops, but mostly rice, would become the wealthiest planters by the 1700s. They would actually exceed the wealth of the tobacco planters in Virginia. Okay, so I did also mention that the slaves would, in many areas, vastly outnumber the white population. And later we'll talk about slave revolt during the 1800s before the Civil War. But again, this was constantly on the minds of slave owners given those conditions. Okay, so now we have to discuss slavery in the northern colonies. And, was there slavery, African slavery that is, in the northern colonies like Massachusetts or Connecticut or what have you? The answer is yes. During the colonial period, absolutely. Not after 1776, right? When the United States was formed as a republic, but in our colonial history, you do see African slavery in the North. But it is not termed or not defined as a slave society. As noted in this slide, it is a society with slaves, rather. They were not the primary labor force. Often they were used as household help, right? If a person could afford a slave in the northern colonies, he used that person to help with household chores, to raise the kids, help with child raising, maybe use as a farmhand on their subsistence farm system, right? Or if they were store owner, they worked in the store. Many of them, the men, had to work as stevedores. A stevedore is a person who is tasked with unloading ships, right? Especially from England, carrying all that cargo for sale in the North American market. Well, it's a hard job to unload all that stuff. So this is the kind of labor that was involved with slaves in the North. Okay. And therefore, because, again, they're a society with slaves, you see slaves in many parts of the North having more rights. Okay. There was laws against their harsh treatment. And they could actually own property, and so on and so forth. So, though slavery is one of the worst things you could experience, of course, as a human being, one would rather be a slave in the North, it's safe to assume, than to work in the South in a plantation system. Now, this brings us to a distinction that historians talk about when you think about African labor in the South, in the colonies, especially in the plantation colonies. And that's the distinction between task labor and gang labor. Now, task labor is a system whereby the master would provide particular jobs or tasks to their slaves. And once those jobs were completed, well, the slave had the rest of the day off, and he or she could do what he wanted. They could plant their own crops. They could rest, of course, relax, spend time with children. They could even rent out their own selves to other planters, right, for some kind of wage, right? So that's unique. But what really takes over is something called gang labor. That's largely because of profit and also due to control. You wanted to make sure you control your slaves. And it was easy to control them if you had gang labor that was imposed upon slaves rather than task labor. And gang labor, as you can imagine, it's labor from sunrise to sundown on that plantation. And yeah, you're working all day out in the fields, cultivating, plowing, and all things involved with farming, right? And obviously very intensive. So gang labor became really the standard operating procedure in terms of African slavery in the South. And certainly that was the case by the time the United States was formed in the southern colonies. Okay, so that pretty much completes our discussion of how Virginia evolved to slave society. And again, this decision, which was, created by the law again, it's a legal evolution. This movement towards the formation of not only racialized slavery, but even what we have here again is racial formation, African American being created by the courts, but being connected to slavery, of course, right? This would um, this would have residual effects on our country. The embers of this event would travel far into our future to the point where even today we are experiencing the effects. We are still caught in the exhaust fumes, if you will, of slavery of our past. So I'm going to leave you with a discussion question, which will be put up on the discussion. Is this, and this is going to be perhaps one of other questions, but when you think about what we just discussed in this lecture series, think about this question: which came first in American history, slavery or racism? Okay, that's something to ponder as you think about what happens in Virginia. Okay, that finishes our discussion of this lecture topic.